Welcome. Welcome to the House of Literature in Oslo, and welcome to this launch of the Norwegian edition of Shoshana Zuboff's monumental book, Overvåkingskapitalismens tidsalder in Norwegian, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. My name is Eivind Refsnes. I represent the Norwegian publisher Spartacus forlag. And I would just like to say how proud we are to be able to present this edition, translated by Lars Nygaard, to the Norwegian public, because it's such a crucially important book. Zadie Smith even called it the most important publication this century. That's quite something. I would like to present my co-hosts this evening first. From the University of Oslo, we have the Department of Criminology and Sociology of Law. Also from the University of Oslo, we have Screen Cultures, and we have Ytringsfrihetskommisjonen, the Norwegian Freedom of Expression Commission. And we are all thrilled and delighted that Professor Zuboff would find the time in her very busy schedule to join us this evening, and she will in a few moments with the inevitable help from Microsoft, Google, even Facebook, I'm afraid. It's very hard to get around these giants in the business, but more of this later. I would also like to welcome those of you following us online. There will be a short Q&A at the end of this session, and you will be able to submit your questions for Professor Zuboff there. If you go to the website slido.com, you can see it here on the screen and on the text at YouTube, slido.com, and you enter the event code 80493. 80493 at slido.com. There's no account needed, but I'm quite sure they're going to collect your IP addresses. So let's get started. It's time to introduce the host of the evening. And we are so lucky to have Mareile Kaufmann with us tonight. She is a leading researcher in the field of digital criminology. She works at the University of Oslo's Department of Criminology and Sociology of Law. She is also a senior researcher at the Peace Research Institute here in Oslo. In her research, she focuses on metrics, on code, on data politics, and our ways of engaging with data valence. She has an internationally recognized voice in surveillance research. So please give a warm welcome to Mareile Kaufmann.
Thank you so much, and I'm very proud of you, Eivind, that you are actually one of the few people that actually knows how to pronounce my name. I was very happy about that. But now, it is my honor to welcome Shoshana Zuboff to spend some time with us here on the screen of Oslo's House of Literature, but also on the screens of the people at home. Shoshana Zuboff is remarkable in many ways. She is a professor emerita at Harvard Business School, and it is truly impressive that she has been dedicating her life as a researcher to issues of digitization and computation, to the evolution of capitalism, and to the conditions for human development. And we shall see tonight how all of these themes intertwine in the book, the Norwegian launch of which we're celebrating tonight, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. It's number 3 in a series of books, which also includes The Age of the Smart Machine, written in 1988. Think about that. And The Support Economy. And since it's been released in the US, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism has created quite a stir. It's listed as one of the top non-fiction books of 2019 by The New Yorker. Prominent voices such as Naomi Klein, Barack Obama, and Zadie Smith have praised the book as a key to digital self-defense. Others were maybe rather overwhelmed by its findings, but in any case, we can agree with the Financial Times judgment, namely that it is a masterwork of original thinking and research. especially when one gets to know at what point this research started. So, not enough with that, I can also promise you that Shoshana knows how to own a stage. I have seen you before. So, please give a hand to Shoshana Zuboff when she now introduces us to her book's argument.
Hello. I'm so glad to be here with you this evening. Can you hear me well? Yeah. Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. We've been looking forward to this evening for such a long time, the launch of this book in your beautiful country. I only wish that I could be there in person and be able to meet all of you and create those friendships. For now, this will have to do, and I hope there's a trip to Norway at another time when we can all be together and discuss things even more deeply. So let me begin by defining surveillance capitalism and some of its surprises. And I would definitely ask if you would keep me on time. Is
right.
That, yes?
Okay, so you can expect that.
You can wave at me or whatever is necessary to let me know when there's 5 minutes or 10 minutes or something like that before you want me to stop, okay?
All right.
All right. We need our friends when we're owning the stage. Thank you. So, what is surveillance capitalism? Capitalism evolves and grows according to a pattern. That pattern goes like this. Capitalism claims things that live outside the market dynamic, and it brings them into the market dynamic, turning them into what we call commodities, things that can be sold and purchased. So famously, industrial capitalism claimed nature for the market dynamic. Those innocent meadows and rivers and forests that were reborn as lumber and sources of energy, things that could be sold and purchased, land, real estate. Now we fast forward to the digital century, 2021, the digital century, the year 2000, and the rise of the digital. Now, what many people don't understand about the year 2000 is that only 25% of the world's information at that point was stored in digital format. Only 25%. Indeed, my first book, In the Age of the Smart Machine, was mentioned a moment ago. I began that work in 1975. That book was published in 1988. That year, less than 2% of the world's information was stored digitally. So think 1988, less than 2%. The year 2000, only about 25%. And then by the year 2007, it was up to 97%. So something extraordinary happened in just a very few years that I liken to an asteroid hitting the surface of the Earth and instantly changing everything, climate, extinctions, requiring millions of years, thousands of years for the world, for animal species to adapt to this cataclysmic change. Okay. So in the year 2000, with the fledgling internet companies in Silicon Valley, there was a crisis. And the crisis was, we've got websites, we're on the internet, we have customers, and we're not making any money. The problem was there were businesses, but it wasn't yet capitalism. And so the search was on for how we create capitalism in the digital age. And that was when an incredible breakthrough occurred. It happened first at Google, but it spread everywhere. So let me just describe that breakthrough. The insight was all the meadows and rivers and uncolonized land, that's all taken. Everything that can be commoditized has already been commoditized. The breakthrough insight was private human experience, your life, my life. Our lives were to be the next virgin wood. Our private experience was claimed as a free source of raw material for rendition, translation into behavioral data. These data were more than what was required for products and services to be invented and to be improved. These behavioral data are what I call surplus because they were used for a secondary process, fed into new supply chains, shunted into new factories. These factories are computational factories. They're known as artificial intelligence, machine learning. Even in the year 2000 at Google, they referred to their capabilities as our artificial intelligence. And what happens in these factories is the same thing that happens in all factories, namely products are made, but these are specifically computational products. And these computational products that were invented early in the 21st century, these computational products were specifically predictions of human behavior, predictions of our behavior gleaned from all this extra data that was now flowing through their supply chains. The very first and globally successful prediction product created this way is what came to be known as the click-through rate. That was Google's breakthrough discovery that it could predict what ads we were likely to click on and click through to the website behind the ad. That click-through rate came from their black box, their computational factory, their AI. And out of that black box, these products came and they made a new deal with advertisers. They said to advertisers, you will no longer choose where your ads go. You will no longer select keywords. We will tell you where to put your ads based on the predictions that come out of our black box. We won't let you see into the black box. We'll tell you the answer. And if you follow that new yellow brick road, it will lead you to more lucrative outcomes, and we'll make money too. Well, the advertisers bought into this new devil's pact, and that created the first markets for surveillance capitalism. These are markets that trade exclusively in human futures, beginning with these predictions of our click-through rates. The huge online advertising markets that now are the exclusive income of a company like Facebook, which right now has approximately $800 billion in market capitalization. And the same markets that account for about 88% of Google's market capitalization, which is closer, not quite at, but closer to $1 trillion, accounted for by these new markets, business customers and surveillance capitalists trading exclusively in the future of human behavior. Human futures markets like wheat futures markets or futures in pork bellies or oil prices. And these markets have become extremely successful, global dominance, and surveillance capitalism quickly spread from Google to Facebook, became the default model in the tech sector, and now moves through the normal economy in virtually every sector, from education and health to real estate and retail to finance and insurance. There is no sector that we can find where executives, corporations are not chasing the surveillance dividend. And let me just define that dividend for you. Google discovered and began to deploy this logic in the years 2000, 2001, 2002. We didn't know anything about it. It was kept secret within that little company. What they achieved, we knew, was that their investors who had threatened to pull out during the dot-com bust never did pull out. What we knew is that that company, like so many other companies in Silicon Valley, did not go bankrupt, but we didn't know why. It was only in 2004, when the company went public, that we were able to learn what happened in those few years between the time that they discovered and began to implement surveillance capitalism until the time that they went public in 2004. Google's revenue line increased by 3,590%. That's what I call the surveillance dividend. And that surveillance dividend reset the bar for not only every little company in Silicon Valley at the time, but by now, just about every company in the world that wants to take advantage of the idea that we can collect data from people at zero marginal cost. Our private experience becomes the zero cost asset for these new processes of extraction, production, and sales. So this has created a world in which we have been suffering under a number of delusions. You know, I call this surveillance capitalism not to be melodramatic, not to just get attention, and certainly not to be dystopian, but rather to be accurate. My point in calling this surveillance capitalism is that wealth accumulation could not occur without the social relations of surveillance, the social relations of the one-way mirror. What that means is that they can see us, but we can't see them. They can know about us, but we can't know about them. They can do things to us, but we can't do things to them. So this inequity, this built-in inequality in the system was absolutely essential because right from the start, they understood that when people learn about these secret mechanisms of learning how to grasp our private experience, to lift it and translate it into behavioral data, and then to use those behavioral data as their proprietary assets for these downstream processes of manufacture and sales. Anytime that people found out about this, they were appalled and they were angry. And of course, people have wanted to resist. How do I hide? How do I escape? How do I find an alternative? And what's happened over the ensuing 2 decades is those alternatives have disappeared. So as a result of this knowledge that they had to keep, that they had to keep their mechanisms and methods hidden in order for this whole system to work. These companies, beginning with Google, moving on to Facebook, ultimately Microsoft, Amazon, and a very complex ecosystem of companies, large, medium-sized, and small, they had to keep their mechanisms and methods secret. And so they learned to master the strategies of rhetoric that would confuse, obfuscate. In English, we have a word, bamboozle. I don't even know how you translate that into Norwegian, but it means to completely mix up and confuse and overturn and disorient human thinking. So the companies have become masterful at what we also call gaslighting. And I bet you do have a word for gaslighting in Norwegian. This is the idea that you say one thing when the actual palpable reality in front of our faces is something completely different. And yet with a straight face, you gaslight. Okay, so let me just conclude my opening remarks with some of these delusions under which we have suffered, and in many respects, we continue to suffer. Number one, they have justified their practices by saying that they're offering us free services, and we believe them. The real truth is these services are not free to us. They come with a range of externalities associated with surveillance capitalism that I know we're going to talk about. The truth is that the value of these services is that we are free. It's not that they are free to us, it's that we are free to them. They have taken our lives as zero-cost assets for these processes that have made them the wealthiest corporations in the history of capitalism, number one. Number two, we think we're using social media. Social media knows that it's using us. We think we're searching Google, but Google is actually searching us. We think these companies have privacy policies when actually those privacy policies are their surveillance policies. We think that these are innovative companies that sometimes make mistakes that violate our privacy. In fact, those mistakes are their innovations. We think that the digital age and the platforms that come, that are operated by these companies have given us access to proprietary knowledge that we never would have been able to access before. And some of that is true, but there's a bigger truth, even greater than our access to formerly proprietary knowledge, is the fact that our lives have been turned into proprietary knowledge for a handful of these companies, which have now become global surveillance empires. Finally, and the most pernicious delusion of all, is that they persuaded us that privacy is something private, something where I can make some personal calculation of what personal information I'm going to share with a given business in return for the service that it offers me. And that I can somehow be in control, therefore, of how much of my privacy is invaded, how much I give away. That is the worst and most dangerous delusion of all. The fact of the matter is that privacy is not private. Privacy is public. Privacy is public because we are not in control of what they take from us. We learned just a couple of years ago that in Facebook's artificial intelligence hub, the center of its computational factory, it processes trillions of data points every day and produces 6 million predictions of human behavior every second. When we think about those trillions of data points daily, only a tiny fraction of those are what we knowingly give. All the rest are what they take without our knowledge, and therefore certainly without our consent. It's not what street we're walking on. It's the stoop of our shoulders and the pace of our gait. It's not simply our faces and our identity. It's being able to translate our microexpressions into emotions and then use our emotions to predict our behavior. This is what I call behavioral surplus. It's not what we post on Facebook. It's whether we use exclamation points or bullet points, whether we say I meet you later or I'll meet you at 7:45, these are the surplus data with rich predictive signals from which they have learned to either predict or infer everything about us that we never intended to disclose. So our task now, and I'll end my closing remarks here, our task now is to understand, how do we free ourselves from these delusions? And what do we do to interrupt and outlaw a rogue mutation of capitalism that is on a collision course with democracy from below and from above in a way that threatens everything we hold dear? Thank you, and I'm looking forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Shoshana, for making very clear, formulating very clear messages to us. I think we need to backpedal a little bit. Let's start out by understanding surveillance capitalism a little bit better. In a sense, one could say that the rise of surveillance capitalism is maybe unsurprising. We have seen financial capitalism grow, and during the past few decades, digital information has become more and more important. Digital information is, again, traceable, it's storable, it can be used for ever new analyses. So observing these trends, we could either expect them to influence each other, or we could expect that someone would seize the economic opportunity of just combining the two. You, Shoshana, remind us, however, that surveillance capitalism is not a necessary result of digitization. What do you consider the key points at which digitization was consumed by capitalism?
All right, well, your point is a very important one, because this is actually another form of delusion that we've all participated in. And that delusion is, the message from these companies has been all along, the way we operate is the result of digital technologies. The way we operate is the inevitable consequence of the digital. And we've all learned in this modern age that it is impossible to object to technological progress, that technology cannot be held back, and that we shouldn't want technology to be held back. And we also know that if anybody raises their hand and says, excuse me, I'd like to go back to the old, a landline and not a mobile phone. The epithet that is thrown at us is, are you a Luddite? Are you going to be somebody who goes in and bashes all the looms in the factory? Because we know that that doesn't work. The technology and technological progress really cannot be delayed. So, for example, when villagers in a little a village of Broughton, England, didn't like the idea of Google's Street View cars coming into their village and taking pictures of all their homes and their streets and their village green, a lot of folks decided to come out and protest, and they tried actually to block the Google car, the little Street View car with its big camera coming up on the roof. And at that point, a man named John Hankey was the head of Street View. John Hankey had invented Google Earth. Originally, it was called Keyhole. It was invested in by the CIA. Google bought it from the CIA venture fund, turned it into Google Earth, and Hankey went with his invention to Google to run it. And his mission in life was to map the world for these proprietary data. Well, John Hankey sent a message to the English villagers. And essentially he said, get over it. This is the future. This is how it's going to be. Everyone has decided. You have to just get on board. But the fact of the matter is that surveillance capitalism is a very specific economic logic. And what this economic logic has done as a result of that surveillance dividend I described to you has hijacked the digital. It has convinced people that it's the same as the digital. And it uses the digital as its Trojan horse to claim every venue, our bodies, our homes, our cities, our cars, our bloodstreams. When we talk about, you said a moment ago, we have all this digital information. Isn't it normal that capitalism would be commoditizing this digital information and making it useful so it can be sold and purchased? Absolutely right. So what we expected was that we would have businesses that were using the vast waves of digitalization to solve disease, to solve the climate crisis, to meet genuine individual needs with all kinds of new businesses, as occurred at the dawn of mass production, meeting individual needs and therefore growing businesses, employing people, improving the quality of life, employing people, these deep reciprocities that have always characterized successful forms of capitalism, reciprocities between capital and its societies, supply and demand in alignment. That's, by the way, what the great economist Joseph Schumpeter had always argued. This deep alignment between supply and demand is what drives capitalism. Well, the surveillance capitalists adopted the idea from Schumpeter of creative destruction, but they forgot that creative destruction was about this larger prospect. So we want companies that are going to use the digital to improve society, improve our lives, meet our needs. That is not what surveillance capitalism has done. It has extracted from our lives to use these trillions of data points daily and produce the million predictions per second, not to enhance our lives. All of these data come from us, but they are not for us. They're about us, but they're not used in our service. They are sold into these narrow markets that trade in our futures. And in that process are the seeds of the fundamentally anti-democratic and antisocial realities, fundamentals of surveillance capitalism.
That actually is a very nice transition to a next question I would have about the recent conquests of surveillance capitalism. You describe quite extreme ways in which data about our behavior is analyzed. Yeah, our digital profiles are linked to political preferences. Our need for love is analyzed to predict the likelihood of liking a brand. Our susceptibility to persuasion is measured. Yeah, just let it sink in, okay? So surveillance capitalism already advanced into the fields that we seize as the intimate core of ourselves. Our homes, our emotions, childhood, biology, excitement, empathy, curiosity, disease, unconsciousness. So in which direction has this trend evolved since your book first came out? I'm thinking about Elon Musk's project to measure brain activity via biosynthetic implants. And at the moment, it is a project that runs on a pig to measure out movements with the idea to develop cures for paralysis. Sounds all very nice and sweet. But knowing Musk's ambitions, the idea could be to access information, thought processes, directly at the source. So I'm asking you, in which direction has the trend to surveil the intimate core of ourselves developed lately?
Yeah, you raise a wonderful example. I remember back in the 1980s when I was studying computerization in the workplace that led to my first book, In the Age of the Smart Machine. I was doing field research for 6 years in the most advanced pulp and paper mill in the world at that time. And I remember talking to the plant manager who said to me, you know, now, people used to be doing things physically in the plant and I could tell if they were working. Now they're sitting in a control room looking at a screen and I can't tell if they're, you know, if they're really thinking, if they're paying attention. I wish I had electrodes that I could apply to their foreheads and I could actually tell if they were engaged with that information on the screen. Now we have that.
We have them.
And yeah, Elon Musk wants to put implants in our brains to augment our intelligence. Let me introduce you to Zuboff's 3 laws. Zuboff's 3 laws. Under the dominant economic paradigm, everything that can be automated will be automated. Everything that can be informated, i.e. turned digital, will be informated. And law number 3, all digital information that can be used for surveillance and control will be used for surveillance and control in the absence of countervailing laws, regulations, and sanctions. Zuboff's 3 laws, I first formulated them in 1992.
Wow.
After spending at that point nearly 20 years of my life already focused on the study of computerization. So you see the problem. No matter what Elon Musk says his implants are going to be used for, without the rule of law to govern, first of all, should these exist, and second of all, exactly how they're used, they will be used for surveillance and control. But even more to the point, Facebook has for quite a while now had a very extensive research project into the technical ability to translate brain patterns into spoken language, into speech. Yeah. And there's a very illustrious erudite group in London, for example, that has been studying this assault on the forum internum. You know, the idea that there is an internal mental space, if you will, that is at least phenomenologically real and palpable to every human being. And the idea that that space can be breached without our consent really is kind of the, you know, the final insult, the very idea of privacy. And it takes our philosophical understanding of will and free will and literally just scatters it to the 4 winds.
Perfect.
So these are pernicious developments.
Oh, and it's actually the last example you mentioned is an excellent transition again to the next question, because we see that surveillance capitalism has not just concrete effects on privacy, as you just mentioned, but it has concrete effects on the human experience and on society at large. And I guess that's also, with social psychology being one of your fields, also one of your expertises. So let us talk a little bit more about these effects. I guess a key aspect of surveillance capitalism is not just that, yeah, as you said, labor and nature are bought and sold, but it's personal information that is bought and sold, and it's consumption itself that's personalized. So you describe the paradox of existing under these conditions very well. And here I quote her directly: "The history of personalization has brought us to a point where we want to have control of our own life, but at every corner, this control is thwarted and self-assertion cannot be actualized." Actually, when I read that sentence, I started to shiver because I thought, I think you put words on a tension that many people of my generation only know as a feeling of frustration. So what else happens to the experience of being human under the conditions of surveillance capitalism?
All right, well, let me approach this in a couple of ways. Number one, we talked about these human futures markets, and I said these are dangerous and they're on a collision course with democracy. So here's how, and this gets directly to your question. So what does it mean to be a business that competes in a human futures market? Well, what you're doing is you're competing to sell predictions of behavior, which means that you're competing to sell certainty. And as a result, a couple of things were discovered. If we're going to win in these competitions, we're going to have the most certain predictions. First of all, we need to have a lot of data. So this is how the supply chain interfaces, just grew and grew. Economies of scale are the first economic imperative for extraction. Okay. Number two, it was discovered we need varieties of data. Just online behavior is not enough. We need data from everywhere. We need everything. So this, my friends, was the mobility revolution. You take that little smartphone, you put it in your pocket, you've got the computer, you've got the gyroscope, you've got the location tracking, you got the microphone, you got the camera, all of that is being activated. Every single app that you put on your phone, I call apps the mules of surveillance capitalism, because every single moment they are trudging along, carrying personal information from your phone into these supply chains onto the factories. Okay, so we have economies of scale and economies of scope. Finally, they discovered in the heat of competition, the most predictive data come from actually intervening in our behavior, learning how to tune, shape, modify our behavior in the direction that is aligned with their commercial objectives. And this is what I call economies of action. This is something wholly new under the sun. And it's important to say that these economies of action, this is a new form of power. How do you use digital instrumentation, the architecture of the digital that surrounds us? How do you use this to tune and shape human behavior remotely? Nothing like this has ever been possible before. These are not people knocking on our doors in the middle of the night to drag us to the gulag or the camp. These are not people threatening us with terror or murder. These are people who come with a smile. These are people who come offering us service and a cappuccino. This is what I call instrumentarian power, in contrast to totalitarian power, because it works its way through the thick instrumentation of the digital that now saturates our lives. So this is an experimental zone that these companies have been very involved with. We've seen it with the Facebook contagion experiments. We've seen it with Google's Pokemon Go. We see it being tested every single day with the bread and butter mechanisms of surveillance capitalism, which are psychological micro-targeting, subliminal cues, engineered social comparison dynamics, real-time rewards and punishments, gamification. These are things that are structured into our engagement with these corporations. And what we have learned since the whistleblowers who told us about Cambridge Analytica a couple of years ago, what we have learned is that these bread and butter mechanisms of surveillance capitalism have now been pivoted by political actors, pivoted toward political objectives rather than the commercial objectives of surveillance capitalism. the exact same mechanisms and methods, which is why on Facebook, political advertising in this election period, this hell that we've been in right now in the United States, that's why political advertising has become such a danger, because it's using these deep, deep mechanisms of surveillance capitalism to modify voter behavior at scale under the conditions of the one-way mirror that we've discussed. So no one knows what's going on.
No.
Okay.
But you do describe, let's actually talk a little bit about this remote controlling thing a bit more. Yeah,
Yes.
you describe that
Yes.
surveillance capitalists draw on the idea of freedom, actually, in many ways, various ways. But some of these ideas seem to contradict each other. So surveillance capitalism, for example, combines a liberal economy, where the concept of freedom, in a sense, sits at the center, with a belief of engineering, which you just said, remote controlling people's behavior, which rejects the idea of free will. So are surveillance capitalists then operating contradictory ideas about freedom?
Well, freedom, going back to what we talked about earlier, gaslighting, rhetorical strategies.
Exactly.
Surveillance capitalism has thrived for 20 years for essentially, I analyzed 16 reasons in depth why it has been able to thrive. But let me name two of the biggest ones. Number one, it has been engineered for our ignorance. People really haven't understood what's going on. Number two, it has thrived largely because of the absence of law to impede it. So in order to maintain this lawless ecosystem, this lawless environment in which it has flourished and grown over 20 years, the surveillance capitalists, have highly evolved libertarian arguments, calling down the whole edifice of neoliberalism, of Hayek and Friedman and all the rest, arguing that market actors must be free, that markets must be free, that laws impede that freedom. This is gaslighting for a couple of reasons. Number one, when the theorists like Hayek and Friedman argued that, and even Adam Smith, let's go back to Adam Smith because that's, after all, where they took it from. Adam Smith said market actors must be free because the market is unknowable. Nobody can understand what's going on in the market, all these millions and millions of transactions. And so in the face of this necessary ignorance, our best bet is for each individual actor to have as much freedom as possible to act in terms of their local interests. And when you put that all together, that will add up to a market that functions effectively. Well, the argument there, of course, is that surveillance capitalists know too much to qualify for freedom. The trillions of data points and the millions of predictions per second mean that they have transparency over what is happening in, quote, the market in a way that has never before been imaginable. Something that even Hayek and Friedman could never have imagined. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, it is utterly, on the face of it, just the apotheosis of hypocrisy. Because, let me put it to you this way. I interviewed many data scientists for this work. One of them, I'll give you a quote from one of them, but let me give you the background explanation first. The data scientists talk about a shift from monitoring to actuation. They say when you have a machine system, you monitor and monitor and monitor. Eventually, you get so much information about the system that you can use this information to actuate, which is to say to automate, to control, to direct, and to do that remotely. You don't need anybody there interacting with the machines. You can do it remotely. So they talk about the shift from monitoring to actuation. And then a data scientist says to me, this is where we are now with human systems. We've gone past that tipping point with human systems, where we know so much about human systems, individuals, groups, populations, that we can use these huge concentrations of knowledge to actuate the human system, to tune it, to tweak it, to send out the subliminal cues, the engineered social comparison dynamics, the micro-targeting, in order to shape human behavior remotely. And the way he summarized this was to say to me, we've learned how to write the music, and we let the music make them dance. That's where we are today. And this is why I say surveillance capitalism is on a collision course with democracy. It constitutes a coup from above in two ways. At the level of grassroots, these processes that we've just been discussing intervene in primary processes of human autonomy, of human will, of individual sovereignty. Without these qualities, the very idea of a democratic society is impossible to imagine. So that's at the level of our lives. Now, let's go up to the superstructure. At the level of superstructure, here is the contradiction. We've entered the 21st century believing that this digital century was to be democracy's golden age. This was to be the time of the democratization of knowledge. This was to be the time of enhanced equality. Instead, as a result of surveillance capitalism, we find ourselves in a world that is reverting back to a kind of feudal pattern, a world where a few elites enjoy huge, unimaginable concentrations of knowledge, that's the monitoring, and huge, unimaginable concentrations of power, that's the actuation that is turned into instrumentarian power. And these concentrations of knowledge and power are represented by the gap between what we can know and what can be known about us, what we can do and what can be done to us. These gaps represent a new axis of inequality. And so instead of the democratization of our societies through the gift of the digital, we are instead finding ourselves reverting to an older pattern of new and extreme inequality, where these elites and their priesthood of data scientists sit at the very pinnacle of the social order, and there are increasing gaps between that elite and the rest of society. This is unacceptable, it is anti-democratic, and ultimately its aim is the substitution of computational governance for democracy itself. This is what has called me to action and motivated my work for so many years to be able to pull back the veil on these processes, these worldviews, mechanisms and methods, and how they work to invade and circumscribe our lives.
So I'm a bit in a draw now, because on the one hand, I really want to ask you something about security politics. On the other hand, what fits a lot better now is actually a different question, because you give us actually a wealth of empirical insight into how human experience is harvested and turned into capital from private firms, of But not enough with that. You actually describe how firms use our data to steer our consumption, our choices, which you've just explained, our ideas, our societal and political development. Now, one thing that I'm really interested in is how exactly do they do their magic, right? Because as someone who is a little bit excited about the nitty-gritty details of how data and algorithms come about and how exactly it is that they come to influence us, I found myself asking, reading your book, do surveillance capitalists make real truth claims about, real claims about the truth, or do they rather co-produce society irrespective of the truth? So let me quickly give you some context. The basis for making claims about the truth is to have insights about our behavior. We've talked about this. But now, some scholars of psychology mention that many psychological variables are unobservable and that there are limits as to whether we can measure them. So when reading your book, one sees quite clearly that information about our behavior and our emotions are made observable by digital data, clicks, likes, all these kinds of things. Surveillance capitalists use our data as what I would call proxy objects, precisely because data, as opposed to psychological variables, can be measured. So our data is used as proxies for the unobservable, but our data only ever captures a part of our lives, and we don't know how well data actually captures our lives. Nonetheless, surveillance capitalism seems to work. Profit seems to be a proof of that. So my question is, how does it work? Is it actual prediction, like the instrumentalist idea that with enough information we can actually know the human future? Or is it fortune telling and selling combined with successful nudging? Where do you land?
Well, where I land is that this is a moving target, which is that sense of the moving target here is why I mentioned earlier that even, right, in the years 2000, 2001, somebody like Larry Page, one of the founders of Google, was referring to their capabilities as our AI. So what AI meant in 2000 is very different from what AI means 20 years later, but still, so this is a moving target, and the predictive capabilities in the year 2001 were not as sophisticated as the predictive capabilities today. And today, we'll look back and we'll see that our predictive capabilities right now, if this line of development continues unchecked, may turn out to be primitive in terms of what they're able to predict in another decade. So I'm always leery when people say to me, well, yes, they're producing all these predictions, but the predictions really aren't that great. I shop for a terry cloth robe 2 years ago, and that ad is still following me around the internet. Well, okay, but the fact of the matter is that most of these techniques were pioneered by scholars. Most of these techniques were pioneered in academia. What we call today psychological micro-targeting was made possible by research that was being published by scholars as early as 2008, 2009, 2010, where it was learned that early that really with just a little bit of data from a Facebook post, you could extract these predictive signals, what I've called behavioral surplus, and you could use those signals to predict political orientation, sexual orientation, personality, at least as it is measured on the 5-factor personality scale, which sadly is actually used in psychology, as a framework for testing and measuring personality. So are any of these things the same as a 10-year in-depth analysis? with a great Jungian or Freudian or other kind of psychiatrist. No. But
They have an
these
impact.
these are actual frameworks that are used within psychology all the time to define and therefore, define personality and therefore predict attitudes and predilections and so forth. Yeah. So between 2010 and 2020, these methodologies have become so much more powerful. It's hard to convey to you how much capital has been brought to bear on the development of these mechanisms. So, you're walking down the street, depending on what city you live in and which country you live in, there are devices and cameras everywhere, which are picking up your face, picking up your body, and in an instant, being able to read the hundreds of micro expressions in your face, translate those into emotional state, which are used to translate into behavioral predictions. The fact that the supply chains now reach into every domain, your car dashboard, calling your children's school to get their grades, calling your doctor's office to get your test results, through virtually every activity that we're engaged in, we're forced to march through surveillance capitalism supply chains. So, Google and Facebook describe what they can do, and it's good to be a little bit cynical, and how much they're idealizing their capabilities. But to be honest, in surveillance capitalism, we depend a lot on leaked documents and whistleblowers and so forth. There was another leaked document in Facebook around 2018. It was written by Australian Facebook executives, written to its Australian and New Zealand business customers, describing its ability to analyze the emotional states of adolescents and young adults in New Zealand and Australia, to be able to pinpoint emotional cycles throughout the week, and to use very fine-grained data about, is somebody depressed? Is somebody introverted? Is somebody sad? Is somebody anxious? A whole list of emotional states that could easily characterize a young adult or an adolescent. And to pinpoint the moment where a high range of this kind of stressful emotion, while, for example, approaching a weekend where there's going to be a party or a date, being able to inform the business customer of the prime moment, the day and the day and the time of day, to send a message for a kind of product that might be experienced as a stress alleviator, something that would reduce stress. So for example, you're approaching Friday night, it's a date, anxiety is rising, send a message advertising a sexy black leather jacket, offer a discount, say we can deliver it for free by early in the morning, and the possibilities of a successful sale go up. So we read this kind of thing and we say, oh, they must be exaggerating. All right, that's point one. Point two, a couple of weeks ago in London, Channel 4 news team, which was one of the investigative teams that broke the Cambridge Analytica story a couple of years ago, they went on air for 2 nights in a row in England, and they broadcast their research into the Trump presidential campaign in 2016 and how it used Facebook's methodologies, Facebook's own methodologies, which is to say surveillance capitalism's mechanisms and methods, to suppress the black vote in key states in the 2016 elections. And as they unveiled what the Trump folks did in 2016, they walked us through step by step what I've just described to you. The Trump campaign had analyses of personality. They had analyses of what kinds of messages people would be susceptible to. They used those psychological insights to micro-target. And when we look at who they targeted, and by the way, in this investigation, the Channel 4 folks actually went door to door in cities like Milwaukee, Wisconsin, talking to the people who had been targeted.
Oh, wow.
Showing them the data that was used for that targeting and saying to them, are these things true? Are you an introvert, or, are you a happy person? And that individual saying, yes, I am. And one woman answering, who knows this about me? Right? So even though it may seem like an exaggeration, and it's been criticized for that, the fact is that the more information we get, the more we understand that this is real. We saw it in the experiments, the social contagion experiments. We saw how it was used in Pokemon Go, and we're seeing it in the political realm. So I think it behooves us to take these claims very, very seriously, because right now they are on the loose and they are changing life in our societies.
Yeah, maybe we're starting to understand now why Spartacus had problems advertising your book actually on Facebook. They actually got a message saying, by the way, this is political content. The first time it was actually only an algorithm. The second time it was actually a real person. I think they have now managed to advertise. Yes, I get a yes from the audience, but it is. One understands, knowing your analysis, maybe why your book may be considered political content. I think it is time
really, I would love to know more about that. I want to know more about that. Nobody told me about that.
Oh, we have screenshots and everything. We can fill you in. Yeah, we'll send them to you for free. I
need to know that.
Yeah, excellent.
That's not. Let's just say that they have Facebook in the United States has refused, or all over the world, and specifically in this emergency election period, Facebook has refused to hold political advertising to a factual standard, and has allowed every kind of misinformation and disinformation to flourish and go viral. The idea that they would reject an ad for my book, calling it political, is obscene, and another apotheosis of the gaslighting techniques that I've been describing to you.
Yeah.
So I'd love to have that information.
Apropos gaslighting, I think it's about time to move on to the part of your book where you ask how they got away with it. And you give us many reasons as to why surveillance capitalists tend to get away with these quite invasive practices that we've just heard about. You mentioned teenagers' fears of missing out. You mentioned the smart, unnoticeable design of apps and hardware. You mentioned the cultivation of the idea that technological process is inevitable. So you also give us many examples of the energy that private firms spend on framing all surveillance as a service of personalization. And when it actually comes to a public outcry about their practices, you describe different examples of how companies use a language of confession, a la, "Ooh, we should not have let it come this far." Now, in the past month, we've witnessed a curious development. IBM and Microsoft announced that they want to stop selling facial recognition software in consideration of abuse and, discrimination against blacks. So the skeptical reader here notices how such decisions to show societal concern are carefully designed to push a company's image. We also see plain contradictions where, for example, Amazon features films on the black experience to help building a country where everyone can live in, free from fear and with dignity, but while they also pitch at the same time profiling techniques to law enforcement. So how do we have to understand the trend that big tech companies wish to take corporate responsibility more seriously these days?
Well, we have to understand it as intolerable. As you know, I say it every chance I get, they have no right to my face. And the idea that the company is the decider in this situation is, in my view, intolerable. It cannot be left to the companies to decide that they can take my face, because that decision right is simply the flip side. The decision right that they have to say, oh, we're going to suspend operations for a little bit until, you all get your act together and develop some laws, or until the heat dies down and people stop complaining about it. So right now, and this goes back to what I said earlier, these companies have flourished and grown from fledgling startups to vast surveillance empires of unaccountable power in only 20 years. And they've been able to do that as a result of the absence of law. So they decide if they're using facial recognition, and they decide if they're going to suspend it for public relations advantages for some period of time. And if they can decide that they're going to suspend it, they can also decide that they're going to return to active operations. So this is all intolerable. All of this has to come under the rule of law administered by democratic institutions, governed by democratic institutions. Because these capabilities are a threat to democracy itself, it has to be democracy that responds. And I ask you, imagine looking back at the 20th century, imagine it's December 31st, 1999, that evening when so many of us were celebrating the change of the century. And imagine that we were looking back on a 20th century that had no child labor legislation, where workers never were afforded the right to join a union, to strike, or to bargain collectively. Imagine that we're looking back at a 20th century with no consumer rights, no rights to safe products, safe food, safe medicines. Imagine looking back at a 20th century without any of the institutions that guarantee security and retirement, what we call Social Security in the United States, that guarantee health care, that guarantee fair wages, that guarantee environmental protections. None of it. That is essentially our condition right now in the year 2020. We are embarking on the third decade of the 21st century, the digital century, essentially marching naked without the charters of rights, the legal frameworks, the institutions that we need to make this digital future compatible with democracy, to align it with our aspirations as democratic peoples. And if we contrast that to, for example, the Chinese, who at least since 2010 have been very intentionally designing a digital future that advances their authoritarian form of government. And this is not only key to their domestic policies, but to their foreign policies. We know of at least 36 countries where the Chinese not only export their surveillance technology, but with the cadres of technical professionals who go to a country to teach the leaders of that country how to use surveillance technology for authoritarian control. So we have one version of a digital future being actively developed, whereas the liberal democracies have failed to do the same with the rise of the digital and our march toward the digital future. And this is why I'm so determined to talk to people every day about the importance of this third decade. This third decade is our opportunity to shift the situation and to become very intentional about creating this digital century in a way that advances our aspirations as democracies. And this is, to my mind, the big failure that we've had so far, democracy asleep at the wheel, something that we can change, and that I have every confidence that we will change.
Okay, but let's indeed close our part of the conversation before we invite more people on stage with the things that can be done to tackle surveillance capitalism. We both know it's complicated. Digital detox, going offline completely, is difficult because technology, surveillance, capitalism are present in most aspects of our life. Even scholarship depends on different forms of surveillance capitalism, especially now that all research and teaching happens digitally and that we stream this very event on YouTube. So opting out is for the privileged. The question is then rather, what can be done to divorce digitization from surveillance capitalism? And you write that surveillance capitalism flourishes in lawless space. You've just explained that. So one avenue for answering surveillance capitalism is maybe law, but regulating something unprecedented, something that we don't know from before, is difficult, which is why law often has a tendency to react. Yeah? Sometimes law can actually make problems, bring it to a realm where we don't really see them as problems anymore. An example of this could be the attempt to make cookies more visible and activize the user by making us basically agree to them all the time whenever we go onto a new page. This attempt at regulating data surveillance via cookies may just lead to a hiccup. If not worse, it may actually lead to non-action, something that we accept without thinking further. I think this is where law failed. So what role can law play in the everyday of surveillance capitalism? This is a question I have for you, and I think I'm going to just add on a second one, because right now we're experiencing that the EU-US privacy shield has been revoked, right? The idea that we can exchange data across borders. That is very new. This happened this fall. I think many US companies are nervous about this move because the EU basically said, we have way harsher privacy regulations than you, so there's no exchange anymore going on. And we know that there is the so-called Digital Service Act coming in the EU. They tried to debate this in December, I think. The idea that gatekeepers of big data companies have to make their data available to everyone. The question is still like, how can we even learn from that data once it's made available? But my question is here for you really, is law the answer? Are these the steps in the right direction? What do you think?
Well, I do believe that law is the answer. And so a couple of points. One is that all of those, the laws and the institutions that allowed us to make our way through the 20th century, even more successfully in Europe than in perhaps the United States and the UK, especially in the last 5 decades. But these laws and institutions completely changed the complexion of industrial capitalism in the United States. And most of this work was done in the 1920s and the 1930s. All right, so the way I think about that work, the legal frameworks and the new institutional forms, this was a period of tremendous creativity, fertile creativity. It happened among cadres of lawyers and legal scholars, policy thinkers, aligned with lawmakers, but also with huge public opinion behind it. The attitudes of the people and the desires and demands of the people really having moved ahead of the law. And I think we're in a very similar situation today. When we look at the survey results, at least in the US, right now, we see numbers in the 80 percentiles and the 90 percentiles of Americans literally experiencing a total rupture of faith with these companies, especially Facebook, I should add. So we know that people are way ahead of where our law is. Even in the United States, which has been behind the EU in law, even in the United States in the past year, we've had 26 serious, important pieces of legislation introduced either in the Congress or the Senate that have been specifically pointed to one aspect or another of surveillance capitalism, whether it's data collection or filter bubbles or misinformation, privacy, and so forth. Recently as yesterday, some of you, I'm sure, are aware that antitrust charges have been filed by the US Department of Justice against Google, specifically aimed at Google search. Well, we have a joke in the English language. You probably have something like it in Norwegian, and it goes something like this. It says, why did the drunk look for his keys under the lamppost? And the answer is because that's where the light was. Why are we starting with antitrust? We're starting with antitrust because that's where the laws are. These are powerful laws inherited from the huge trusts and monopolies, the 19th and 20th century, and our creative response to fight those concentrations of power, of economic power. So we begin where the laws are.
Okay,
and that's important.
We begin where the laws are, but you also speak to us, the people, in a sense, right? I was also wondering, maybe it's also the task of researchers to maybe make technologies that have become so well integrated into our everyday lives a little bit more visible again. But indeed, you also appeal to everyone, including the next generation. And I think you make that point, you made that point clear right now when you said, actually, it's when people were ahead of the law that things started flourishing. Now, you close your book by asking all of us to be the friction. And I quote, "There is a social void that needs to be filled with creative new action. We need to claim our right to a future tense, and we need collective action to ask for sanctuary." Now, how can we tackle surveillance capitalism, not the law, without falling into classic dynamics of power and counterpower? I do happen to work on ways in which hackers, but also kids and art projects answer surveillance. And what I tend to notice is that we need activities that can change surveillance from the inside, from within. And I know that your vision is a digital environment in which we do not need to hide. You make that very clear. But I was wondering, can hiding as a statement not also subvert surveillance? What are our options, as in the people's options? Does our reaction need to be as unprecedented as surveillance capitalism itself is and was? That's my last question, and then we'll continue with you.
Well, this is exactly where I was going. So as I said a moment ago, we begin where the laws are, and that, in my view, is why we've begun with antitrust. Is it relevant? Absolutely. Is it sufficient? Absolutely not. Beginning with the laws that we have does not absolve us from the need to engage in that same kind of creativity that allowed the 20th century to ultimately tether industrial capitalism to the aspirations of a democratic society. So we need that same kind of creativity now. And I do mean that in terms of law and collective action and rights for the following reasons. Sure, as an individual, I can withdraw myself from all of these operations, and I can hide, I can go dark, but that's not going to change anything. This goes back to my premise: privacy is public. And any more than as an individual, I can affect the course of climate change, of global warming. As an individual, I cannot affect the course of surveillance capitalism. As a collective, we can.
Okay.
If 1 million of us or 100 million of us decide to go dark, that is a powerful statement, and that has an effect. And not only does it have an effect on the companies, but it has an effect on our friends and on their friends.
Oh, yes.
Because they'll come with us. So as a collective, an unprecedented collective form of action, where a large segment of a population decides to go dark until a corporation either, fundamentally changes its policies, or until our elected officials enact the laws that we need for democratic protection. That can be a new form of collective action. Ultimately, that collective action, what we can do together, has a purpose. It's aimed at something. It's aimed at an enduring new condition of existence. And that enduring new condition of existence depends upon law. It depends upon the embellishment of democracy so that we can reconceptualize rights in this democratic age. For example, and this is why I emphasize that the co-determination of all of these forms of action, charters of rights, legal frameworks, institutional forms, new forms of collective action, these all move in symbiosis. Let me talk about rights for a moment, because that was the theme that you ended your question on. I have never needed a right to my face. I have never needed a right that says, only I can have my face, and you are not allowed to take my face, and you are not allowed to take my face for downstream purposes of manufacturing sales. I've never needed that right, because for the entirety of the human experience, my face was mine. Somebody might draw a picture, somebody might even take a photo later, but those things were discrete and bounded, and they faded in time. and they had, at each stage, they had limited consequences. It was, in fact, the rise of photography that led to the formal statement of privacy rights in the United States with Justice Brandeis. But so there's this technological evolution, the evolution of our material conditions. For the first time in history, we're at a point where my natural right to have ownership of my face or of what I do in my home, of what is said at my breakfast table, or the activities that go on in my car, or my run on Sunday morning in the park. We have come to that moment in history where elemental rights to our sovereign experience now have to be translated, codified into legal rights. Mm. And when you look at the history of rights, every codified right, every formal legal right has gone through this kind of evolution. For example, for most of the human experience, it was not necessary to have a right to free expression, a right to free speech. As long as a person or child was physiologically intact, you could open your mouth and make sound come out. You could speak. You didn't need the right to free speech. It was only at a level of social development, of the political density, when a codified right to free speech became necessary. And the same thing is true now for our rights over our private experience to be sovereign. Who knows my experience? I know. Who has the decision rights over who knows? I have those decision rights. I decide who knows my experience. Mm. I decide if my experience is translated into data. I decide how those data are shared. I decide how those data are used. These are what I call epistemic rights, knowledge rights, that should be codified and accrue to the individual. So that's one kind of challenge that we have. Another, and that's, let's say, at the supply side, the upstream point in this long sequence of surveillance capitalism that I've described to you. Let's talk about downstream. We have markets that trade in human futures. I'm saying those markets have predictably dangerous consequences that are on a collision course with democracy. Mm. So my view is that the one very effective way of interrupting surveillance capitalism is to eliminate the financial incentives that come from such markets. So let's say that markets that trade exclusively in human futures are illegal. Just as we say that markets that trade in human organs are illegal, or that markets that trade in human beings are illegal, because we know that those markets have predictably dangerous anti-democratic consequences. And we can now see that markets that trade in human futures also have dangerous anti-democratic consequences. Mm. If we were to make such markets illegal, we would very quickly be eliminating the financial incentives that come with, for example, psychological micro-targeting, subliminal cueing, engineered social comparison dynamics, and the other mechanisms that we've discussed. Mm. And that would very quickly change the landscape, open it up for other kinds of businesses, other kinds of competitors, as we talked about early on, who would want to use the digital, but in ways finally that align with our needs and our social values. Mm. So I think that there are many unexplored opportunities for creative law, creative charters of rights, creative institutional forms, creative collective action that comes from this unprecedented experience and speaks directly to it. Purpose-built for this age that we could not have imagined, that most of us reject powerfully when we understand it, and clear the way to a digital century that fulfills the promise that we once believed in, and advances our lives as citizens of democratic societies, the liberal democracies all over the world.
Wow, thank you. I wish there would have been more violence in the room, violence in the room when you uttered these last words. I would like to now invite two institutions to join our conversation, because they actually have a history and a mandate, which you just mentioned, of engaging with the themes we discussed today, and that is Norway's Freedom of Expression Commission and the project Screen Cultures. Both are co-organizers of the event, and their representatives are excited to ask questions from their specific field. So it's a pleasure to be joined by Bente Kalsnes, who is an associate professor at the Institute for Communication at Christiania University College and a member of the Freedom of Expression Commission. It would be awesome if we could get more chairs onto the stage. And by Steffen Krüger, who is a senior lecturer at the Department of Media and Communication at University of Oslo and an initiator and leader of the project Screen Cultures. So please give a hand to them coming on stage now. I hope you see them too. We're kind of spread out as
I see you
COVID
beautifully.
makes us.
Can you still see me? Because I just sat down.
Like we see you everywhere in this room. So maybe we begin with Steffen. Do you want to ask your question?
Yes. Well, thanks so much, first of all, for a lovely presentation. I'm in awe of the book. I read it. It has to be said as I read it as a sermon, but like as a converted already. So, and that brings me also to my question. While I was reading, and now we talked a lot about we have to convince people to go dark. You also said that people are already ahead of the law. I am wondering what kind of how do we need to communicate that information that needs to go that needs to come forth to the people in order to bring about this change in laws and to create the public opinion, to bring us there, to introduce laws that go effectively against surveillance capitalism. So what kind of communication would it take to activate more people? Because and when you said we think that we need Google, but really Google is we use Google, but Google is using us. There is something in our everyday usages of those services that we still seem to experience as deeply useful. So it's not only the platforms, but it's also those platforms and the services are embedded in everyday lives and in a logic that makes those services seem so useful. And also, how do we communicate it, and what kind of effects through the communication do we want to achieve in a broader set of people?
Well, I think we communicated in every channel, obviously, as you've seen, I wanted to start out communicating by bringing a comprehensive analysis and comprehensive data and evidence to bear on every single aspect of my analysis, so that precisely, in fact, so that it could not be rejected as merely political, as apparently Facebook tried to do, but understood as deeply grounded in fact. Okay, so here's what I've experienced since The book was published, as you know, late 2018 in Germany and January 2019 in America. I've seen the language of surveillance capitalism showing up in music, in art exhibitions, in a whole variety of books and newspaper articles, editorials, op-eds. I've seen it showing up in the theater. We've had original plays being written based on the book. We've had other plays like Kafka being adapted to the 21st century using the theme of surveillance capitalism. And we've also had an entire rap album put together by some very famous rappers, where the themes of surveillance capitalism were threaded all through the songs on the album. We've seen the movie The Social Dilemma, the movie The Great Hack, so we've seen it penetrate into film. And I can bring you right up to date with a cartoon, a drawn cartoon that my kids love. It's Phineas and Fergie. Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Anyway, so somebody sent the other evening, there's a line in the dialogue in this cartoon. It's an animated cartoon. And there's a line in the dialogue of this animated cartoon about surveillance capitalism.
Perfect.
And a note to me that said how much this, oh, and also there's a rock band that's been writing songs about surveillance capitalism. And there was a note to me related to the animated cartoon that said how much the subject matter of this book has permeated a younger generation, which was, I think you've read the end of the book, so you understand that was one of my main goals, was not just to speak to my colleagues, not just to speak to those who already agreed with me, but to speak to younger people. It's easy to be younger than me, but younger people, you know, in their 20s, even in their teens, certainly in their 30s, who are inheriting this world, people your age.
I'm a bit older, but that's not.
You're a bit older. Okay. Well, I'll blame it on
thanks
the
very
screen.
much.
We all look very fresh and
And your
normal.
casual look.
At a distance.
At a distance, COVID has also its good side. Okay, but maybe we are actually approaching way over time. So maybe we're going directly to Bente. Do you have questions?
Yeah, thank you. I would like to congratulate you with this book and the Norwegian translation. I think this is really wonderful that we also can read it in Norwegian. Because I think the language and the terms are very important. I think that's a very important contribution. You have given us words to describe what is going on, and we can describe our societies with these words. We can criticize our societies and potentially change them, because words impact how we look upon the world. And as a representative of the Freedom of Expression Commission, I would like to ask you, how can surveillance capitalism, which you characterize as a profoundly anti-democratic force, be a threat to freedom of speech? And is it any way we can regulate or impact to make sure that we secure freedom of speech?
Well, this is a very relevant topic right now, as you can imagine, in our election period. And we've seen over and over again where misinformation and disinformation has been allowed to flourish online specifically in social media and even more specifically in Facebook, calling on free speech as the legitimation factor for allowing obvious misinformation and disinformation to prosper in these environments. So I have challenged Mark Zuckerberg on this topic. I believe that Mark Zuckerberg's use of the term free speech and driving these practices under the flag of free speech fundamentalism is another form of gaslighting. You see, this has been a theme throughout our conversation. He's talking about free speech as if he's a dedicated constitutionalist. As far as the American Constitution goes, it is the Fourth Amendment, which is the freedom from search and seizure, that is far more relevant to Facebook's practices than the First Amendment. And if you disagree with that statement, then I would be willing to say it's at least as relevant as the First Amendment. I say it's more relevant because the entire premise of the business operations of a surveillance capitalist empire like Facebook, the entire business is built on a fundamentally illegitimate operation of stealing private human experience without consent and translating that into all of these downstream operations that we've been discussing. So the whole thing is built on theft, and therefore I think the Fourth Amendment is even more relevant. Be that as it may. If he were such a dedicated constitutionalist, he'd be very concerned about the Fourth Amendment. But he does not appear to be concerned about the Fourth Amendment, only the First Amendment. Pondering this, it finally became clear to me that when Mr. Zuckerberg talks about free speech, he doesn't mean free speech as in my right to speak whatever I want to speak. What he means is free speech. He means that our speech must be maintained as a zero-cost asset to his company in order for it to enjoy the nearly $800 billion market capitalization that it currently enjoys. That's what free speech actually means right now in this domain. And that is how we have to respond to these transparently hypocritical claims. Now, having said that, there is a bigger challenge for us, and it goes back to what we were discussing moments ago, and that is that the free speech, as it's written into the American Constitution, and I assume with a similar situation to what I'm about to describe in Norway, free speech is an ideal that was formulated in the 18th century. And certainly, if we talk about the American Constitution, we talk about sources from John Locke to Thomas Jefferson, how these 18th century revelations have been passed on to us in our 21st century lives. But our material conditions are fundamentally different. What Durkheim referred to as our conditions of existence are fundamentally different. Part of this creative response that is demanded of us now is how do we understand free speech, this cherished and necessary ideal? How do we understand its implication under our current conditions of existence, which include digital connection on a global scale? It's like having a city's water system and opening up the city's water system so that anybody can come along and drop in whatever they want. Maybe it's something good like fluoride so we don't get cavities, but maybe it's poison that kills people or makes them very, very sick. We wouldn't have that in a water system in our city, but that's exactly what we have in our global communication system today without law. So here is the sort of kernel of exactly the kind of creative work that we need to do, thinking and rethinking rights for the digital century. Make sense?
Yes, thanks.
Maybe we have one follow-up question, in fact, about, since you just mentioned, or came back to law, how can then such a small country as Norway do something about this? Do you want to ask that question?
I mean, we're here in Norway, we're not a member of the European Union, and you've been talking a lot about laws and regulations, and as a small country, a small community, what can we do? Do we have to rely on larger communities such as the European Union, or what's your suggestions?
You know, what immediately comes to mind is the example of New Zealand and the pandemic. New Zealand is a small country, comparatively, certainly by population, with a brilliant and courageous leader who made New Zealand's pandemic response a beacon for all the world. And I see nothing that would prevent Norway from doing exactly the same thing when it comes to the digital future, as advancing the prospects of a liberal democracy. Let Norway be a beacon, and let us all look to Norway for the teaching, the lessons, the experience that can help guide all of us. Because the leadership of the EU, as I understand what I read and what I hear and conversations that I've had, the leadership of the EU is committed to finding this path. Increasingly, we're seeing leaders in the US and in the UK committed to finding this path. Be a beacon. The road is open. The opportunity is there.
Hear that, Norway? Hear that. So we actually want to answer Shoshana's call for more public engagement. So we want to know how you, our audience, actually think about these topics and what your questions are. We don't have time for much of them, but we encourage you to ask questions to Shoshana, and you had the chance to send them to us. We could have had the chance to let you guys even rank these questions up and down, but we thought, you know, instead of getting that click profile from you guys, what you think is the best question, we thought it's better that you focus on what actually happens on stage. Now, we have Per Jørgen, who formulates at least one question that comes from the audience today. You won't see him, Shoshana, but you will hear him, I'm positive.
Hello, Professor Zuboff. Well, the questions, they've been flooding in, so, and we would have spent all night to answer all of them. But, so I guess I made a difficult choice just to select two. The first being one who writes, I'm a student working on changing IT education. What are your thoughts on the responsibility of IT education when it comes to cultivate our future IT leaders? The second question goes to also contemporary political
Can I answer one at a time, or how do you
would you like to one at a time, or would you like both?
Yeah, I'll try to be quite brief so that we can get more than one. Okay, but on the question of IT education. IT education is absolutely essential. Look, we're in a situation right now where virtually every app is designed to participate in and feed into surveillance capitalism. With contact tracing, for example, we've seen small countries, even different states in America, some of our states, trying to design their own contact tracing app and being surprised down the road that without their knowledge, They were using a template that came from Foursquare or a template that came from some other company, and discovering that that template had built-in surveillance capitalist properties with exposing location tracking and so forth. So my point is that there are taken for granted disciplines now in IT design that have surveillance capitalism baked into the cake. IT education needs to become critical and reflexive and open up that playing field to other paradigms.
Thank you. And I guess the second and last question from the audience this time is, we are 12 days away from the US election. What do you think about the use of social media and campaigns, and how would you respond to those defending the use of social media in political campaigns? Because they think it can help level the playing field in politics, where money and access to formal communication channels pose huge barriers to new entrants.
Well, yes, I mean, this is a huge conundrum right now. And of course, it's fantastic as a political candidate to be able to communicate with people, especially during this pandemic season, which has been brutal for well-intentioned, substantive, important campaigning, to be able to contact lots of people, get your message out, create interaction, have online interchange and so forth. Okay, so let's contrast that to paid political advertising. The first big problem right now with Facebook and US elections is that Mr. Zuckerberg has refused to hold political advertising to the same standards of fact-based content that all other advertising is held to. This is a blatant political accommodation to Mr. Trump and the Trump administration. It is natural for a surveillance capitalist to curry favor with political power, because surveillance capitalism, as we've established, thrives in the absence of law. So the very first thing that should have been done and could still be done in these last days is the elimination of political advertising altogether. And if not that, at the very least, the elimination of all political advertising that does not pass the standards of fact-based truth. And that would still leave plenty of room for well-meaning, important, necessary campaigns that are the backbone of our and every democracy, to reach out to their constituents, to have discussions, to communicate messages in the absence of paid political advertising that is intentionally designed to disinform or misinform the public.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah, big closing words. Shoshana, we would have had so many more questions. I know there would be questions about Google schools, about kids' digital rights. We could go on all night, as we say. But then there's also COVID restrictions. So at some point we have to move because the air doesn't move anymore in this room. So we are very grateful that you joined us from the US. It's a real treat, and it's really engaging to hear you speaking. And thank you for actually sharing decades of your research with us, of your critique, of your knowledge and your know-how. And thank you also for reminding us about the urgency to keep learning and to keep sharing knowledge with each other. And in this spirit, we appreciate the time you took to answer our thoughts and questions.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you to all of you who've been asking me questions, brilliant, insightful questions that make me happy because I know that you've read my book. And thank you to all of those who are listening in, watching in. And I wish you good reading. I wish you good thinking. I wish you a future as a warrior for our democracy in this digital age. We need every single one of you. We join together, not as users, but
Right.
as individual citizens, members of democratic societies who understand that our future is worth fighting for, and that's something that we do together. Thank you all.
That's wonderful. Thanks so much.
Bravo. Okay.
I hope you at least hear the applause in the room, and we very much hope that you enjoy the day at the site of your Atlantic. We will enjoy the echoes of your talk over some fresh disinfectant, everybody, okay?
Well done.
Great.
Be safe. Be
Okay,
safe, be
you too.
healthy. Well done. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Alle sammen, takk for at dere kom. Bare pass på å holde den gode avstanden hele veien ut. Og så sitter en veldig hyggelig bokhandler der ute, veldig på overtid. Så det er utrolig koselig hvis noen tar med seg boka hennes hjem, så blir Nordli også glade. Takk for at dere kom.